Mother and Dad were married in Lincoln at Halloween in 1908 in the house that Aunt Ida had built, especially so that there would be a proper foundation for the wedding celebration. And she wanted to do it right, so she sent to Frank Lloyd Wright, who was just beginning to be famous then, to see if he would design a proper house for her. And he sent a student down to Lincoln who made the design and made several really interesting aspects of the house. It had lovely big flower windows in the front that looked out on the street, and it's still under historic preservation in Lincoln because it was built early on and because it had a kind of special design. So the wedding took place then, and they went immediately out to Idaho, where Dad had a job with the Idaho Reclamation Project, which had been organized to build dams along the Snake River all across the southern section of Idaho to reclaim the desert and make it possible for people to farm, they hoped. That was in response to the whole development in the 19th century of homesteaders in the West to fill up this whole huge empty section of the United States and to make the land productive. So he started in the winter of 1908, and they could begin building the dams in 1909. Helen was born in the first one of the camps they had established up in Richfield, Idaho, in the summer of 1909, and the house that they had, the company had put up a hotel for people in that town, and then they built one little house, as I remember, and the rest of the construction was tar paper shacks for the people who worked on the dam, and many of those people were Chinese. They were called coolies, and they were brought in because they worked very hard and because they were very cheap, I suppose. Anyhow, the dam was completed in about the end of 1910, and they moved to Boise, to 1108 North 22nd Street in Boise, where I was born in 1911. And I have no conscious memories of that house, but once when Helen and I went back about 20 years later after we had gone down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, we came back up again and went to Idaho to look at our old house. And I had a very curious experience. I have no recollection whatever consciously of that house, but as I walked in, everything seemed very familiar, but very small. And I knew exactly where all the rooms were. I could wander around in the house and find just where things had been. So that was a kind of an interesting indication that you have lots of memories that you don't know about. And when the jobs when the dams were all built on the Snake River, Dad and Mother went down to San Antonio on another job down there. We stayed there about a year, and I have only one memory of that. And that was of walking along on a sandy road and opening a gate. That's the only memory I have of San Antonio. So I'm sorry, San Antonio. It would have been nice to have a little bit more recollection. When that job in San Antonio was finished, Dad was out of work again, and I just said, well, come on up to Lincoln, because everybody wants to see you again, and you have lots of friends here, and you'll be able to get work here, I'm sure, which he did. And she said, come and stay with me, because it would be lovely to have you here. And so we moved into 1941 B Street with Aunt Ida, and Dad got a job as the city engineer. And we lived there. It must have been about 1913 or 14, just before the First World War. And we lived there until 1917, when George was on the way, and they decided they'd better get a house of their own, and we bought a house at 1811 Cherry Street, which is now Sumner Street in Lincoln. And we moved away from Aunt Ida's house, but we often went back because she was always so good to us, and we would go over and visit her and visit Aunt Julia Love next door, because the family they were all very kind to us. And I can remember once when I had the mumps, Helen, we had two friends who were just about our age, Margaret and Catherine Clapp. Their mother was a friend of my mother's, and they were just the same age as Helen and I. So our mothers decided that they would give them preschool instruction in reading. So of course Margaret and I both sat in on the Helen and Catherine's meeting, so we learned to read along with them. But Helen and Catherine were bored to death with having their little sisters with us, and they used to try to escape from us because they thought we were interfering with their pleasures. And I remember one time I got the mumps, and Helen was afraid. Mother had told her to stay away from me because she might catch them, and she couldn't get away from me for hard enough. She just would escape from me anytime she could, because I looked so awful, she said. I looked so awful, she couldn't stand it. But anyhow, we then stayed in Lincoln at 1811 Cherry Street and all the three boys were born there. And that was a very interesting time, because at the end of the war, George was born in 1917, and at the end of the war, when the boys were all coming back from the First World War, all the people in Lincoln were asked to please provide for Thanksgiving celebration for the ones who were coming back. Often they had to change in Lincoln to go on to wherever they were being deployed to. And I remember we had 3 or 4 soldiers at Thanksgiving dinner. We had a big table of people, and little George got down from the table early. He had a little chair. He was pushing along on the floor, and he fell over it. He was a very delicate little baby, and he fell over the back of the chair and passed out. And my father and mother, I think they knew that there was a nurse across the street who might be able to know how to resuscitate him. So they grabbed George and went out into the street. This was cold weather. It was Thanksgiving time. And the nurse came right out from her Thanksgiving dinner and began resuscitating George by tossing him up in the air and catching him, tossing him up and catching him. And then some of the other men, as soon as she got tired, they would take him. And Helen and I were just desolate. We didn't know what to do with that poor little baby out there being tossed up and down in the middle of Cherry Street. And so we went upstairs to get out of people's way, but put on our Dr. Dens and sat in the round window that looked out over the street and watched them taking care of little George. And finally we saw that he was breathing again, and it was like being reborn. So we had lots of interesting memories of Cherry Street, because people didn't go to hospital to have their babies then. They had a nurse come, and we had a nurse who took care of all of Mother's friends when they were having children. Her name was Grovey. And Grovey would come and stay in the house, and she was a real martinet. She ordered everybody around, and everybody had to do what she told them to do because she was the nurse. And it was a very interesting kind of existence. You had to have lots of people helping you then. There were 2 maids because there were so many little children, and then there was the washwoman. We had a German-Russian washwoman whose name was Margaret Bowl, who had come over with a whole big a group of German Russians who had been released by Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great had lured them into Germany to teach teach the Russians how to be good farmers. They had come over from Württemberg in Germany, and had lived in Russia for several centuries. But when they were threatened with being forced to do military service, they wanted to emigrate, and a whole group of them came to Lincoln, Nebraska, and settled down in the western part of the city. And they would do the heaviest work. They were wonderful workers. The men were icemen and coal men, and their wives would work on the trucks with them, and they built a civilization for themselves that was really admirable, because they lived in little tiny houses on stilts, because the ground was salty and they couldn't grow things in the ground. But they were as tidy as they could be, and hardworking, and determined to have a good life for their children. And their children, the children of those immigrants who had worked so hard, went through the university and became doctors and lawyers and all kinds of very substantial citizens. Well, Margaret Bowl would be down in the steaming basement doing the laundry when it was time for her to come for lunch. And that was how I first learned a little bit of German, because Mother would say, "Now go and call Margaret for lunch." So I'd shout down the cellar stairs, "Mittagessen!" And up she'd come, steaming away from the laundry. And she was so good-hearted and so good-natured. It gave us a really wonderful impression of those people. And after the three little boys began getting bigger, my father said, "We've got to have more room. This city lot's no place to raise three boys." So they looked around for a larger place where they could turn them out to pasture, and found a house out on South Street where there was 2.5 acres. And they decided that would be big enough so that Mother could at last have a big enough garden that she liked, and the boys could roam around, and we could have animals, and life would be simpler.
When were the boys born?
In 1917, 1919, and Lou in 1921. And then Ida was always she was always right there helping Mother. And she decided that it would help Mother if she took me out to Estes the summer that Lou was born in 1921, because she was building the cabin that summer, and it would take me out from underfoot in Lincoln, and she would enjoy having somebody around in the house out there. So I had a wonderful time in Estes with her, all by myself, except that the Clapps and the Morrells and a number of other families in Lincoln had houses on the hill, and Ida had picked out that spot in Estes because it was on the hillside with a lot of her friends. The Gears had the nearest house, and they all had children who were about our age, so we used to have a wonderful time playing all kinds of games all over the hill. We played Run Sheep Run and all kinds of hiding games, and we used to go down fishing in the Fish Creek, and it was a marvelous kind of summer because nobody feared anything could happen to us. We were just turned loose, and we could go anywhere all over the mountain and find things and collect flowers and explore. It was unusual. We didn't realize it at the time what a marvelous experience for children it was just to be out in nature without any restrictions at all, and with plenty of company to enjoy it. And Aunt Ida was always there to make life pleasanter for everyone around. I can remember still how happy she used to be when people would come to see her. There would be this radiant smile of welcome as people drove up to the back of the cabin, and that would be just an introduction to all the things, the pleasures and things that she could think up. Building the cabin itself was very interesting because she went up, she decided she wanted to have she was going to have a very special cabin. It wouldn't be like anything else that had ever been built. And they were having people come up onto the burned over forest on the side of Long's Peak that summer, and if they would take away the standing relics of the trees that had been burned, they could have them for free. So she got organized a couple of trailers that were pulled by a team of horses, and these men, we would go up with them, and she would say, now I want that tree over there, and those three over there, and I want those four over there, and take all of those trees over there. And they would cut them down on the spot, load them on their trailers, and drag them 16 miles over to where the cabin was to be built, and dumped this huge pile of wonderful silvery burned trees on the hill, so that the cabin could be made of logs. And then we had to get a man who would strip off the bark on three sides of the logs, leaving the best part of the exposure of the bark, what was left, or of the silvery skin of the trees. And we still have the frame on which he laid those logs and stripped with his adze, which is something different from an axe. He would strip down the three sides of the logs and pile them up and get them ready to be built in. First of all, we had to collect all the rocks for the foundation. So Aunt Ida went up with another team of horses and a mason up on the side of Sandburn Point above the cabin, because there weren't any other houses up there except one way over on the side. And she would say, I want the keystone rock, that shall be the keystone for the fireplace, and get all of those rocks over there that have nice moss on them, and take all of these. And she chose all of the rocks that she wanted for the foundation of the cabin, and they were hauled down to the spot. Then the masons came and built the foundation, and then the carpenters came and laid the logs on, and gradually at the end of that summer of 1921, the cabin began to take shape. And then we had to go out again the next summer to put it in. The meantime, of course, she built the shack so that she and I had a place to live while the cabin was being built. And that was down below the hill, right where the old little bathroom was down there. Originally, it was moved up later. So we had that one little cabin, and she had an oil stove, and we would cook our dinners. And she had also, everything she had was always special. And she had chosen for her automobile a Franklin car, because Franklin cars were not cooled by water, they were cooled by air, and she thought that was much more practical because it was a kind of an original idea. And the Franklin was always kind of a spectacular way to. There were little vases, little etched glass vases on the inside. It was all very fancy inside. And then the outside, when we were traveling around with our friends in the mountains, there would be maybe a parade of 6 or 8 cars. We would all have to stop at every little mountain stream to get water for the other cars to cool the motors, and the Franklin just sat there being cooled by having the motor run with air in it. And we always thought that was something very special. It was always very practical. So we had lots of very interesting, very sociable times out there, because people stayed all summer in order to get away from the heat in Lincoln. And I went to Prescott School, which was at the end of Cherry Street on 20th Street. And we had a temporary building, because the school was it was a very old school and was getting too small for the number of children. And so they had a little temporary, and the grade school that I went to had to be be held in the temporary building. We always thought that was very special because we didn't have to be in the big building with all of the Pueblo. And so then I came out of school, they kept pushing me out. The teachers, I think I must have been a thorn in their sides because they were always eager to have me move head up into the next class, get rid of them. And I ended up about a year and a half ahead of myself because whichever teacher I had kept pushing me out. There were 5 of us that got pushed finally into the 5th grade, and then I could stay with my own class from then on. And after the 5th grade, we moved over to the new Prescott School, which had been set up on about 4 or 5 blocks away. And we had, my memories of school were all very happy. Because we had so many friends, people lived in the neighborhood, it was all so easy to walk to school, and all your friends were along with you, and you could walk home and be with your friends still, and still you had very good teachers. I think we had very strong and determined teachers, and there was a good sense of the solidity of the school. There was none of this ability of the parents to get children given special attention because of something the parents wanted, because Mrs. Morley, the principal of Prescott School, she was lord over everything, and if she said this was going to be done, that was what was done. But that was all right because she believed in good discipline, and it expedited the learning that children could do. I think I think there is a great deal to be said for a strong, structured place for children. And we were the last class to have an 8th grade in Prescott. The next classes were going to be put into a junior high school, which would be 6th, 7th, and 8th. And no, that was 7th, 8th, and 9th. So that we went into Lincoln High School as freshmen. The last class that they had as freshmen, the rest of them all came later. So we had a big celebration when we graduated from the 8th grade in Prescott. And we had, Winnie Webster and I decided that we would do a Siamese twin act. So Aunt Ida said, well, come on over and look in the trunks upstairs in the attic. You could probably find some skirts that are big enough to go around both of you. And we had a ball looking at these old 19th century dresses, dressing up in these clothes, because there were trunks and trunks of them that they had inherited from somewhere. And we got ourselves decked out and got ourselves, we made a speech that we can still remember. I saw Winnie this month when I was out in San Francisco, and we could still go through the spiel that we had for our stunt for the 8th grade class. And that was, we had a wonderful time in high school because we had come along through school, so we knew each other for so long. It was wonderful to have the continuity of friendships that still go. And when I was in Lincoln, I saw one of my classmates from freshman class in high school too. She's still living in Lincoln with her husband, who was also in that same class. So it's wonderful to stay in one place, and the people who keep on living in Lincoln, lucky things, have that advantage still. Well, I should tell you about the drive out to Estes with Aunt Ida, because that was an experience in itself. It took 3 days then to drive out. We could drive as far, if we had very good weather and very good luck, we could drive as far as McCook, which was 250 miles from Lincoln. And there was a hotel there where you could stay overnight, but it was a very questionable one. And the night that I remember the most was on a very hot June night. Aunt Ida and I landed in McCook, dead tired from driving all that way, and went up to our room. And we hadn't been in bed very long before we began getting bitten unmercifully, just bitten everywhere. And Aunt Ida got up and said, "I can't imagine what on earth it is." So she threw back the covers, and the bed was filled with bed bugs. You could see them all over the place. And she said, "Get out right away and get into the bathtub." And the bathtub, of course, was at the other end of the hotel. But anyway, we got into the bathtub and drowned the bed bugs on us. And then we went down to talk to the man what to do. And he said, "Well, the only thing I can do is to put the legs of the bed in cans of water, and I'll have to find some cans." So he rustled up some cans and took them up to the room and put the bed legs in the cans of water. But there were already so many bed bugs in the mattresses that didn't help at all. And we had the most horrible night. I've never spent such a night as that. In the morning we were all swollen up with bed bug bites. But anyway, we had to go on. And as soon as we got into Colorado, the hotel accommodations were a little bit better. We could stay in Sterling then, which was about 200 miles further on from McCook, and that was a nice place. We could shake off all of the results of the night before and then drive the rest of the way into Estes without any problem. But one time when we had driven out to Estes, Dad used to take us, drive us out, and then he would come back because he couldn't stay out. He had too much business to do in Lincoln, and he would have to leave us at the cabin and go back. So one summer we were all driving out. There were the 5 children and Mother and Dad, and all of our baggage, and then the 2 maids came out because one maid wouldn't stay by herself. We had to take along somebody for company for her, and all in what we called Hattie the Hack, which at that time I thought was an enormous, big Studebaker limousine. But recently I saw a photograph of it, and it's just a little bit of a car, but it had jump seats and room in the back so if there were 9 people in it, you can imagine, with all the baggage, it was a little cozy. Most of the people were small, but still, Hattie the Hack was, it seemed to us like a real equipage, and we loved it dearly. And that summer, we had a wonderful time with the little boys, because they started then from early on to get acquainted with the mountains and to learn the makeup of the whole park, and to really understand what the wonders of the mountains could provide for everyone. And that was such a pleasure to be with them and to have them out there. And always there was that unbelievable freedom. Nobody worried about us. If we took care of the little boys, we had sense enough not to take them too far away from home. And we could roam over the whole mountainside and not have anything bothering us. And it was an unbelievably rich experience, both in getting acquainted with the mountains and getting a feel for the animals that lived there, and fun with the other people. It was a wonderful childhood that we had, and I don't suppose it's possible in many places for children to have that much freedom anymore. And one time, there was also some of that freedom when we went out to Mother's sister, Aunt Hattie Anderson, to visit her. She was so cordial and so hospitable that we often went out to the farm in Genoa to visit all the family. They were such a welcoming, wonderful family, and the farm was a beautiful place. there was a huge, long stretch of bluegrass from the house down to the road, and lined with cedar trees on either side. It was called Cedar Lawn. It was a lovely big old house, and it was filled with life all the time. She had 5 children, 4 very lively boys, and 1 daughter. And when they came home from the war, her 2 oldest sons, Charlie and Lewis, had both been, no, I guess just Charlie. I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether Lewis was also in the First World War, but Charles came home after having had some experience with an airplane, and he decided that he wanted to have an airplane in Genoa too, and got one, a little tiny bit of a Beetle-looking airplane, and parked it out on one of the North 40 pastures, and that was a great excitement. And after he got through playing with the airplane, it was his mother wasn't all that enthusiastic about his flying around because it was still very early in the aviation world, and it wasn't all that safe. So he took the carburetor out of the airplane and decided to put it into his jitney to see if he could make his jitney fly off the road. And he called his jitney Muddy Maud. I don't know what kind it was. I think it was a Chevrolet. And this, his story was that if he would go down the hill, Maud, the territory out there is very hilly. They were called the Washboard Hills, because you go up and down, up and down. The road just went up and down every step of the way. You were either going up or down, hardly anything on the level. And he said if he went down the hill fast enough, Muddy Maud would take off and fly over to the middle of the next hill and take off. Well, of course, none of us experienced that. We had to take his word for it, because the rest of us had to go a much more pedestrian way. The cars weren't always strong enough to go down go up the hills. And I remember one car we had wouldn't quite make it up to the top of the next hill, so we had to turn around at the bottom of the hill and back up the hill, because the rear going backwards was a stronger gear than going frontwards. Back up to the top of the hill, turn around, go frontwards down the hill, turn around at the bottom, backwards up the hill, and so on until we got over the Washboard Hills. But that was only part of the excitement of being out there. There was always something interesting going. They had so many animals and so much going on the farm that was always a delight. And our cousin Art, who was just a year older than Helen, was always so good to us and took us around and showed us all kinds of things. And there were ponies to ride and cows to herd. And Art his family would give him an animal to take care of. And his first animal was a pig. And he decided to name the pig, I suppose it was a sow. He named her after Helen. And Helen wasn't delighted at all to have, they would say, well, now old Helen, she's had so and so many piglets. I think she had a litter of 20 this year. And Helen would look very downcast. She tried to change the subject. And the next animal he was given was a cow, and he named her for me. And so they'd say, well, old Margaret, and so on. So we were dedicated to ourselves in the shape of animals. But anyway, the farm was always a wonderful place. And they had a kind of telephone that was called a party line. You had a big old telephone, a great big old telephone in your kitchen, and you cranked it in order to get the operator, and the operator would answer, and you would tell her who you wanted to call. Then they had a big advance that each family would get one ring. That is, one family would have 2 longs and a short, another one would have 3 longs and a short, another one would have 4 shorts and a long, and so on. So every one of the families in the neighborhood on the party line, there might be 20 people on one party line, would have its own special ring. And Aunt Hattie was always very cordial and having parties. And I remember one time she said she was inviting 2 of the neighbors to come to a party. And when she rang them up, she could hear click, 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 click all along the line as everybody take down their receiver to see who she was talking to. And when she had finished inviting these neighbors, she realized that half of the whole neighborhood was listening in, and so she said, "Oh, come on, all of you. We'd love to have you all come." So instead of just having 2 or 3 families, the whole neighborhood would arrive. And she was always so cordial. They worked so hard, but with such joy, because in those years, in the early 20s, it was very good farming, and the problems that came later didn't plague them so much. And she and Uncle Art were very joyous uncle and aunt, who enlarged our experience of life considerably. And then when I went to high school, just about the year I went to high school, which was 1924, Helen earned enough money so that she could buy a horse. One of her friends, Peg Ames, had a horse. And so Helen thought she'd like to get one too. Peg had, they lived on 20th Street near Prescott School, but they had a big barn so they could keep the horse there. And we had enough room out at 4300 so that we could keep a horse too. And so she earned $50 and went with Dad down to the sales for horses that were held out in the country, and they found Yankee, who was a beautiful little sorrel horse with blonde hair and mane. And Yankee was a very important part of our life from then on. Mother and Dad built a pen for him and fenced in the pasture so that he had a nice 1.5 acre pasture to plunge around in, and then nice little house. And Helen rode him. Sometimes she turned out not to be so enthusiastic about him as she thought she was going to be, so that I had a chance to ride him quite often. And then the next door neighbors thought it would be nice. They had an old buggy that they had used. They had a team of horses and had a buggy before they'd gotten a car. And so they gave me the buggy. And that was a wonderful thing, because I was only 14 then, and I couldn't drive. And by hitching Yankee up to the buggy, then Charlie Anderson got some tackle arranged so that I could hitch Yankee up to the buggy, and we could go careering around the countryside all we wanted to. And one spring when I was a junior, it was the most beautiful day, just one of those exquisite spring afternoons. And I had study hall the last period, so I thought, oh boy, this is the day to go. So I went around to all my friends. I knew where their classes were. Went around to them and told them, and I'll go home and get Yankee, and I'd bring the buggy down and meet them in front of the school at 3 o'clock, because I could take study hall off and go and get him, hitch him up and get down to school by the time school was out. So I landed there, and they all came out, and there were 7 of us, and 2 people could sit in the back, and 3 people could sit on the seat if they squeezed real hard. And then if I stood up, I guess there were only 6 of us. If I stood up, no, there were 6 of us. If I stood up and drove Yankee, then there was room for us. And so we thought, where would we go? Well, of course, the only thing to do was to go down to the university campus and parade around. So we went looping down from high school down to the campus, and thought we were making a big sensation down Anyway, we had a lot of fun. And the next morning, then I delivered them all back to their houses afterwards and took Yankee home. And next morning when I went down to homeroom, my teacher said, Miss Pound wants to see you. And I thought, oh, she has some nice piece of... She said it rather seriously, but I thought, well, there's good news, surely. She was the assistant principal, so I went down happily into her office, and she said, where were you yesterday afternoon? And I said, it was so beautiful. I went home and got my horse, and we went for a buggy ride. And she said, that's your idea of what school is for? And I realized that the clouds had come over the sun very quickly. And I said, well, I didn't have anything to study, and I didn't think I was losing anything. And she said, if that's your idea of the way schools should be organized, you can just go home now and stay there. And I thought, I don't believe it. So I went on home, and my mother said, what's the matter? Are you sick? And I said, nope, I've been expelled. And she said, what? She knew Olivia Pound. Olivia Pound was Roscoe Pound's sister, and they'd all grown up in Lincoln together. They all knew each other. And she said, Miss Pound expelled him? Yeah. So she went upstairs and put on her purple velvet hat and took me by the hand and took me back to school. And went into Miss Pound's office. They were on first name basis. They knew each other well. And she said, Miss Pound said to her, Edith, what kind of children are you bringing up? Are you making them just scofflaws? And my mother was really set back on her heels. She couldn't believe it. And when she came out of Miss Pound's office, there were tears in her eyes. And I've never felt so murderous toward anybody as I felt at that moment toward Olivia Pound. I never got over feeling that way. That she would speak to my mother that way, you know. Well, anyway, I got stuck right back into school. I didn't have any chance to enjoy my vacation at all. But when my brother Heavy was in school, he was also a troublemaker, just like me. Both born on November 17th. I guess that was an unlucky day to be born. Anyway, he threw a lighted firecracker out of the window one day, and they expelled him. And my father took him back and said, is that really going to be the kind of punishment that will make him feel that he really wants to be a good law-abiding citizen? Wouldn't there be something? And he gave a piece of his mind to the assistant principal, and it didn't take any word from him. But Heavy got stuck back into school right away too. He didn't have any chance to enjoy his being expelled. But Lincoln High School was a good place. It was a very good school. We had very good teachers. Almost all of them were really memorable teachers. And we were talking about, when I was in Lincoln last week, we were talking about what really marvelous teachers we had. Some very representative kind of people. And that I think it must have been about June of 1928 when I graduated from high school and discovered that there was a training course for airplane piloting being organized at a new school which had been developed because of Lindbergh's influence on the old school that had existed in Lincoln for a long time. And I decided that I would like to use the money that I'd earned working while I was in high school for training. And so I went ahead and found out about the course without ever mentioning it to my parents. But then I told them that I thought it would be an interesting thing to do, and I would like to go ahead. And they didn't say anything to discourage me, but they got Helen into the picture, And she decided that what we ought to do is take a trip out to Idaho and see the house where we had lived out there, by way of the Grand Canyon. And we'd go to visit the Grand Canyon, go all kinds of places. And of course that was too big a temptation for me, and I gave up the idea of using my money for airplane piloting, and decided to go with Helen. And we'd asked a couple of sisters who were friends of ours to go along with us to help with the expense, and we drove out and had a wonderful time in Colorado, and then drove down to the Grand Canyon and were exploring there, and Helen went in to find out what the possibilities were of getting down into the bottom of the Grand Canyon, which there were three possibilities. You could walk down and walk back up again for free, or you could walk back down. You could walk down, and if you got something wrong with you and couldn't walk back up again, for $7 they would send somebody down to get you. And or you could rent mules to take you down and to take your gear down, and with a guide, and you could stay at the wonderful restaurant and hotel at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and that cost $25. Well, we only had $100 for the whole trip, so $25 seemed like too big a bite out of it just for one night. And so she decided that the best thing would be to go down and then not be able to walk up and ask somebody to come and help us up. The two sisters were not very experienced walkers, but the park rangers discouraged her from that. They said that wasn't really a very good plan. It would be much better to rent the mules. So we blew our whole $25 wad on renting mules, and each one of us had one mule, and then there were two mules for carrying our luggage, and a very nice guide to see us down. And we started down the wonderful Kaibab Trail that goes down through all the layers of geology which have been deposited in the North American continent, from the alpine layer all the way down to a very low layer. It was fascinating going down, but the path was straight up on the right side and straight down on the left side. So one of us asked the guide if people very often fell off the trail, because you go straight down into the bottom of the canyon there. And he said, no, well, the mules sometimes fell off, but usually it was because they were packed unsafely. But he hadn't lost any people. They hadn't fallen off because they had a tendency to lean over toward the mountainside rather than toward the valley side, and they usually were able to stay on the path. So we had to got down into the bottom of the canyon and got settled in our beautiful rooms in the hotel down there. And then we went off to explore the canyon floor and discovered that they had a wonderful peach orchard with ripe peaches. And the peaches were just about to fall on the ground, and so we helped them and had a real feast of ripe peaches, and then came back and had a feast of other things at the center, and rode back up again the next day for an unforgettable trip. It was the most wonderful experience to see all those layers of earth that had been deposited on the North American continent, one after another. And because the Grand Canyon slices through that whole layer, that was one part of the wonderful experience. Then our two friends left us, and Helen and I went on up to Boise to look at the house. And that was a wonderful experience too, because when we stopped, the people who lived there then were very cordial and let us go through, which I think I've told you about before. So that was a lovely way to celebrate graduating from high school. Helen already had started at the university. No, she had been at Wellesley for her first year. While I was a junior in high school, she was away at Wellesley. Then she came back for her sophomore year and continued to finish at the University of Nebraska for her 4 years. And I started university that fall then. Helen was a junior and I was a freshman. And we started with rush hour at the Kappa Alpha Theta house. It was assumed that I would be a Theta because all of the relatives on both sides of the family who'd ever gone to a university had been Thetas, so that they had to take me as what was called a legacy. They were obliged to take me, and I had no problem then deciding whether to join or not. And that was kind of an interesting experience, painful at times, but I suppose valuable in overall. And I enjoyed the university particularly because all my friends from high school were freshmen too, and we could continue our activities as in the university. It was altogether a very happy experience. I had very fine teachers, and for the most part, and could explore all kinds of areas that I never would have thought about before. And one of those areas was sociology, which was a fairly young course to be studying at the university. And I had a very good teacher who had several courses, and I decided to change my major from journalism, which we assumed that we would take. Helen also, because we'd had so much fun in high school working on the newspaper, that we just assumed we would go on and study journalism and work on a newspaper when we came out. But the sociology was so compelling and so fascinating that I was lured away from concentrating on journalism. And when I got out, I had only a double major. And after the university, there was a necessity to find a job, and that was 1932, and there weren't many jobs available. But Adele Eisler and I got in the car and decided to go out to all of the little local newspapers around in the countryside to see if we could get a job on a country paper. That was the idea, is that after you got out of college, you started your newspaper career by working on a country newspaper where you would be setting type and selling advertising and meeting the public and going out and getting stories and doing the whole job and get a sort of an overall picture of what a newspaper printing career was like. And we went around to about 8 or 9 little villages where there were newspapers and interviewed the editors. And they were very nice to us. They took time away from their desks, took off their glasses and listened to what we had to ask them about. And all of them said, "Well, girls, it would be just lovely to have you here, but you can see I'm running the newspaper by myself now. I have to do everything, and I don't have any money to pay anybody because the people who used to advertise don't advertise now anymore. It's the Depression. You've heard about that." And we certainly had. And so we came home empty-handed. And my mother said, "Why don't you go back to school and learn about something that you can write about?" And so I enrolled in the graduate school then that fall. And I'd had some very interesting experiences along the way because through the University YWCA I had gotten acquainted with the YWCA secretaries in Lincoln, and one of them asked me to come out and help organize the junior high school clubs. At that time, the YW had what were called girl reserve clubs in every one of the junior high schools and in the high schools that had been very active and very, very useful in educating youngsters and giving them an experience in doing something for other people. So with one of my friends, Dot Weaver, we set out, and then another friend, Alois Trester, joined us, and the three of us then decided that we would help with these after-school programs in the junior high school. So that was very interesting and lots of fun, and we learned a lot that way, and got a little experience in working with kids and finding out how different children in junior high school then were from the way we thought we had been ourselves. After I graduated, we had a series of people who came through to recruit volunteers to do work in some kind of an organization. One of them was recruiting people to ride mules to take aspirin around to the country people in the Appalachian Mountains. That was the Friends Service Committee, and I thought the Quakers are nice people to work with, and so I volunteered to go and work in the Appalachian Mountains that summer. But they finally let me know that they were running out of mules, so that they wouldn't be able to take me on, but suggested that I try the settlement house in Omaha if I were interested in doing something like that. So I went up to visit there one time and was thoroughly enthralled with what I found, because it was so lively. It was right on the edge of the packing houses in Omaha, and the head worker was Helen Gauss, who was the great-granddaughter of Carl Friedrich Gauss, and a simply delightful person, a little short lady with pinch-nose glasses, pince-nez glasses, and a bright outlook on life. And she had organized or she had come on very early on to be head worker at the Omaha Social Settlement. After she had graduated from the settlement backgrounds that she had absorbed after she finished college, she went into the college settlement movement in Boston and got her training there, and then came out to Omaha, and she was very much interested in doing things. There were lots of different nationalities in her neighborhood and all through Omaha, and she was interested in doing kinds of things which helped especially the European immigrants to gain recognition for the culture that they had brought from their own countries. And she organized folk festivals and folk art shows and all kinds of things with each of those nationality groups, especially the Czechs and the Poles and the Yugoslavians, many of whom were also in her neighborhood. So there were those groups, and then there were all kinds of other people meeting in the settlement, and I thought it would be lots of fun to work with them. But I had to go back to graduate school, and along in December she called me up one day and said, "Would you like to come up and work, because my assistant has left?" And so I dropped graduate school that night, and the next morning went up to start work at the Omaha Social Settlement. And that really was, it infected me with a bug that I never have lost. And I stayed with her working through the next spring. And then she said, if you want to go ahead and stay in this movement, you have to go and you have to find out what the rest of the settlement movement is like and get acquainted with the settlement people, and the best way to do that is to go to the settlement conference, which was held in May, and then find out where you can get good graduate training and get it. And so I went to the settlement conference in Detroit in May and was just fascinated by the people who were there. Jane Addams was there, who had founded Hull House, and John Elliott, who had founded one of the big houses in New York, and many of the other leaders in the settlement movement and founders, pioneers in the settlement movement, which had had been started by Jane Addams in 1890 when she came back from working with the settlements in London and started Hull House in Chicago. So that I could see what the history of the settlement movement was from the very beginning, and became very much interested in it. Found out where you get the very best training to go ahead and do work there, and they all said Northwestern University is that they have the best courses. So on the way home from Detroit, I stopped in Chicago and went out to see the head of the course at Northwestern University, Neva Boyd, at Gads Hill Center in Chicago, where she lived. And she told me all about it. And there was another girl who had been at the conference who came with me, and she told us exactly what the courses were, what the kind of work was that they were preparing for, and so on. All we needed to know about it. And then Ruth, the head of the Gads Hill Center, the director of it, came into the room where we were talking, and Neva Boyd said to her, "Ruth, is that residence job here open this fall?" And Ruth said, "Yes. Would these girls like it?" And we said, "Yes, we would." And so she said, "All right, you can divide the work and divide the income from it then, because that will pay your board and room." So we thought that was wonderful, and we parted company then and went back, and I was all registered to go into Northwestern then the following fall, the fall of 1933. And that fall proved to be one of the exciting experiences of school, because we could see where all of the work that we were doing in school would lead, and it was a very good course, very thorough, and with special emphasis on the music and dancing and literature of the foreign groups who had come to the United States, because almost all of the settlements were set up in neighborhoods of immigrants from Europe and from Asia, and were dedicated to helping them get a foothold in the United States by getting recognition for the culture. So that summer, I returned back to Omaha and went on working at the settlement house through the summer, which was quite a different kind of program with the children and the young people than it was when they were in school. And we had very interesting times. We could do lots of things with them, getting them out into the country and doing very special kinds of programs at the house. And through all of that experience working with the children, there was the main substance of the objective of the settlement movement, which was not to move into a neighborhood and tell people what to do, but rather for people of a different background to move into this neighborhood, get acquainted with the people, find out what their objectives were, what their goals were, and help them achieve them themselves. So that the settlements were very active. And Miss Addams, Jane Addams, had of course started that purpose in Hull House. Work with the people, find out what they want to do, and help them achieve it themselves rather than doing it for them. And that was one of the objectives of the settlement movement, which appealed to me the most, because it seemed to me to give people the strength to go ahead and do it then themselves. And we worked with the people in the packing house area to, for instance, persuade the packing houses to control the air that they shot out in the middle of the night, which was filled with the most ghastly smells that you can imagine, and that settled down over the neighborhood. They had agreed to do it in the middle of the night, so it wouldn't disturb people so much, but it still was very unpleasant. And the neighbors worked with the packing houses to try and modify some of the unpleasant effects of it. And of course, it was helping them to work with the labor movement so that they could improve their working conditions and so on. A whole gamut of other things. So in the fall, they began sending me on from Chicago, sending me to various people who needed workers. And one of the places I went was the pants factory, the BVD factory, run by the Reliance Manufacturing Company in Michigan City, Indiana. And that was, they had organized a recreation department for all of their employees. And so they took me on without knowing about how green I was to the whole business, and let me help organize this clubhouse that they had set up, where the employees could come down and meet with each other socially, and they could do things with their husbands. Most of the employees in the factory were women. And I realized what was happening in that. This was the fall of 1934, in the middle of the Depression, when unemployment was increasing everywhere. And what had happened was that the factory, which employed the men in Michigan City to build the Pullman cars for the railroads, had been shut down. So all the men were out of work, and the women had had to go to work, so they had filled the jobs in 2 or 3 different manufacturing companies that were making underwear in Michigan City. Reliance was the largest and the best of those, and they tried to follow good union practices with their people, but they had a great difficulty because the other little manufacturing companies could take advantage of the law, which provided that they could employ women at $10 a week as beginning workers, and then after 6 weeks or 6 months, there were various times allowed, they could fire those people because they were unsatisfactory and take on another bunch of people at $10 a week instead of paying them $15 a week, which was what the Reliance employees were getting. But these little companies were making it impossible for Reliance to sell its underwear because they were undercutting them in the cost of production. So that the Reliance company had to close in the spring of 1935. And in the meantime, as I was working there, I saw what the situations for the families were doing. The husbands would take their wives to the plant and leave them to work all day while they went home, took care of the children, took care of the babies, fed the children, took them to school, got them back, and it was corroding the self-confidence of the men who were there. We often had men's parties up at the recreation club, but I could see the difference that it was making in the relationships, and the women told me about how difficult it was for them to keep the spirits of their husbands up while they were unemployed, sitting at home. They were, most of them, first-generation Americans, and they didn't have a background in how to accommodate themselves to such a deep change in their ability to be the boss of the family and take care of the family and be the whole support of the family. And because I'd made such good friends at the conference of the settlement house with Lily Peck, who was secretary of the National Federation, and with Helen Hall, who was head worker of Henry Street Settlement, and some of the other settlement people, I wrote to them about what was happening so that they would know what in one neighborhood was going on. And I was very deeply concerned with what was happening with those people, and I hated to be let out of a job. But the thing that really was the most wonderful experience was that the girls, here were these women running families, supporting their families on $15 a week. And they said to me, Miss Day, it's terrible that you're going to lose your job. We're going to talk to the manager and see if he won't put you on a machine so that you won't lose your job. So, just at that point, Uncle George was driving out to Lincoln to spend his vacation in Lincoln, and asked if he could pick me up and take me home, because the manager didn't think I would be any good on a machine, and he didn't really respond to the possibility of taking me on in the factory, and so I did lose my job. So I could go with Uncle George, and we went out to Lincoln, and then there I was, out of a job again. But not very long after that, I got a letter from Lily Peck saying there are some jobs opening up in New York, and you should, if in a settlement house, and it might be that something would appeal to you, and you should really take it on, because the jobs are very scarce now. And a little while later than that, I got a letter from Helen Hall saying, would you like to come and work at Henry Street Settlement? Which, of course, was one of the best settlements in the country, and I just couldn't believe it. So, Mother came upstairs. I remember that when the letter came, it was special delivery. And she came upstairs where I was sleeping on the old sleeping porch at 4300 and flicked it over my nose, because she sensed that there was something in that letter. And so that's what it was. Period.